Welcome! This is part 3, our third video in our 5-part video series that tells the fascinating story of how the United States ended up acquiring all of its vast territory that now comprises the continental United States. So in parts 1 and 2, we saw how and when these various European empires crossed the Atlantic Ocean and came in to own and occupy almost all of what is today the United States. So now that those empires are in the territory, what happens next? Well, let's jump right into part 3. We've now seen 4 European countries that have occupied territory in what now is the United States: Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England. This reflects the extent of ownership of the 4 European powers that we've been discussing. So yellow depicts Spain. So Spain started it off with Christopher Columbus coming to America in 1492. Spain came in this way through Mexico and up through Mexico into the United States and occupied territory that is in the southwest United States and also the west coast in California, all the way up to the northern boundary of California. Now, Spain also sailed up this way and landed on the east coast of Florida and occupied Florida. France we see depicted in green. So France came in through the St. Lawrence up here, and they came in through Canada down into the United States to occupy the Midwestern region of the United States, all the way down to the Gulf Coast and New Orleans. And you see depicted in white here the Netherlands, or the Dutch. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that doesn't look like very much territory. And you're right, comparatively it's not that much territory, but it is a lot of territory, but also it's important territory geographically because it's New York Harbor, and up the Hudson River along the East Coast. And then you see Britain depicted in red, and it includes the red hash marks as well. So Britain came in from the east and settled along the east coast and then expanded out westward. So they established their territory here from the east. So Spain was coming in from the bottom, France was coming in from the top, and Britain was coming in from the side. They were coming in from everywhere. So it is truly extraordinary here to see that almost the entire United States was occupied by these 4 European powers. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, maybe it wasn't for that long. But in fact, it was for a long time. So some of the territory occupied by Spain held for around 300 years. That's even longer than the United States has existed to this day. So that's a pretty long time. Even Britain, who came in late to the game, they came in here, Jamestown, in 1607. That was 170 years before the United States declared independence. 170 years Britain occupied this territory. That's a long time as well. So it is truly remarkable to see here that the United States was owned and occupied by these European powers. So these 4 European empires are hanging out here in the United States. And what were they doing? Were they like having barbecues and getting along like good neighbors do? Unfortunately, not. What they were doing was fighting with each other. I mean, it was amazing. So the French are doing raids on the Spanish colonies, and the Spanish are destroying French forts, and the French and English, they're all killing each other and destroying their colonies and stuff. I mean, it was just amazing. And these poor colonists, as if you didn't have enough to worry about with growing your own food and making it through the winters, and the Native Americans and all that. you also have to worry about being attacked by these other colonial powers. I mean, it was amazing what they were doing to each other. But that's what they were doing. They were all fighting. So the story between England and the Netherlands is that the England and the Netherlands were colonizing in sort of the same area along the eastern coast, and northeastern coast of the United States, and roughly at the same time in the early to mid 1600s. So in the same place and at the same time, they've got colonies that they're trying to build out and expand, and they're trying to acquire more territory, each of them. Well, this was a recipe for conflict. So in 1664, the British sail warships into New York Harbor, into this place which is now Manhattan, and this was the center of the Dutch colony here, and they threatened the Dutch. So what do the Dutch do? Well, there was this guy who was the head of it. His name is Peter Stuyvesant, and he surrenders. He just surrenders, and he gives it all up. Not only does he surrender New York City, but he surrenders all of the territories possessed by the Netherlands at that time. He says, Britain, you can have it all. But one of the things that he does is he negotiates very favorable terms. Okay, so basically what he says is, look, Britain, I understand you guys are way more powerful than us. You've got bigger guns. We don't stand a chance against you, England, going to war. So we really have no choice to surrender. But England, let me just tell you, we've got a pretty good thing going here. All right, we've been at this now for a while. We've got a number of settlements. They're very successful. Our people are happy. We've got good trade. We're making a lot of money. And by the way, we're a very multicultural, tolerant society. So we would welcome British people in. British people would fit right in. So instead of just wiping us out and being some oppressive power, you can take us over and we'll acknowledge that we're under your crown, but why don't you just keep things going the way they are and just join us? And Britain says, okay, that sounds like that might work. So in these terms, that's what these terms of surrender were. So as a result of this, a number of the people stayed from Netherlands. They weren't killed. They didn't torch the city. The society basically survived and was able to continue, but under British rule. So Britain plants the flag. They rename the city from New Amsterdam to New York, after York in England. So New York, that is the beginning of New York and New York City. So the Netherlands are gone, but their culture has survived. Their culture survives to this day. In fact, so the Netherlands, the Dutch created this, the beginnings of New York City, New Amsterdam, and it was this very multicultural, socially diverse place, and that has carried down to New York City today. That's one of the reasons why New York City is so diverse and multicultural. Its culture is, and that's because that's how it started, and that's how it operated. So another thing was what Peter Stuyvesant said to the British was, he said, look, one of the things that keeps us so successful is that we can practice different religions. So will you honor that? Allow these people to continue to practicing their different religions and allow them to have freedom of religion. And British said, yeah, okay. So they wrote that into the terms of the surrender. The other thing they did was, which is amazing, is so when the British took over, the Netherlands freed their slaves in this new colony in the New York area. So that was tremendously significant. So this establishes free black people very early on in the New York City, New York area. So this is the mid 1600s. You had free black people. So that was pretty cool too. So it was even though the Netherlands now is out of the United States when Britain takes over, the impact of the Dutch remains to this day. I mean, there are so many things to this day where you can trace back to the Dutch culture. One is just all these, the culture itself, the fact that New York City is so multicultural and diverse today, but also all these names. There's all these names of places, like cities and streets and streams. It's amazing. Catskills is one of them. The Dutch name the Catskills, and you have Knickerbocker, for example. The name Knickerbocker, that was a common Dutch last name, surname. So like Smith, in the U.S. today, Knickerbocker was a common name. So you think of, so today, like the New York Knicks, the basketball team, Knicks is actually short for Knickerbocker. So the New York Knicks is a legacy of Dutch, which you don't commonly think about. Also, actually, the name Yankee is thought to be a heritage of the Dutch. So this was a common name, like Joe Smith today. It was Jan was the first name, and Key was the second name. Jan Key became Yankee, and now you have the New York Yankees baseball team, which again traces its lineage back to the Dutch. It's amazing. And the people as well. I mean, there were so many influential people that became wealthy and members of the elite of this country, not only in New York City but also up along the Hudson River. That's one of the reasons that area has become so influential. And there are a number of well-known people like the Roosevelts. The Roosevelts are one family. So this was the Roosevelts produced two presidents of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt and FDR. So, they were cousins. They were, sort of cousins, like fifth cousins, although Teddy was older. But they lived at the same time. They knew each other. In fact, there's this great letter. So when FDR was at Harvard, so he was at college for Harvard, while he was at Harvard, FDR becomes president of the United States. Teddy Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. So FDR at Harvard, while he's in college, he writes this letter home to his mother, dear mama. So he says, the other night, our cousin Teddy came over and visited me and my friends at Harvard. And we all sat around and he told all these stories. It was amazing and it was great fun. So that's one way to make friends at college is, you have your cousin who's president of the United States come over and visit you at your dorm and, tell you and your friends a bunch of stories. So that's pretty good. But both of these Roosevelts, so both Teddy Roosevelt and FDR, both presidents of the United States, trace their heritage back to one guy, Claes von Roosevelt, who came over from the Netherlands to the New World, New Netherlands, in like the mid 1600s. So his family descended to produce two presidents. So it's amazing to think when FDR was president, his family had been in this country for 300 years. It's pretty amazing. So the Dutch certainly have had a long and lasting impact on this country, both the New York area as well as the country as a whole. So they're out now. The Netherlands is out. They officially no longer own any territory in the United States. So now we're down to Spain, France, and England. And what do? Well, they, of course, continue to fight. Now, when they fight big time. So these countries have been fighting with each other for years. I mean, it is centuries, actually centuries. It's amazing to go back and look at some of this history. I mean, it's all the wars, on again, off again, on again, off again, all these different countries in Europe fighting each other. It's amazing. So that's what they were doing, not only in the new territory of the United States, but in their empires around the world. So you skip ahead to around the mid 1700s. There was this 7 years war that breaks out, and this was in 1756 to 1763. And this was truly a global war, a world war. We think of that World War I was the first World War because of its name. World War I makes sense. It was the first World War. But in fact, there were all these other wars that happened on a global basis, and this was one of them in 1756, the 7 Years' War. So this was, the people who were fighting, France, England, Spain, Russia, Austria, Sweden, all of these countries were fighting, and they were fighting all around the world. They're fighting in Europe. They're fighting in all their colonial territories. By this time, a number of these countries had colonial territories, so they're fighting in India and, all these places around the world. But where did the war start? Turns out that the war started in the United States. And in fact, it may have started by accident, and it may have been by one guy who we all know. Okay, so it started in the United States, and what happened was it started because of sort of the boundary disputes. So as France is building out their colonial territory and England is building out their colonial territory, their boundaries sort of overlap, and this creates conflict. Here we see the boundary between France and Britain. So the French territory is depicted in blue. British territory is depicted in red, and right along here is the boundary line between the two. And this is where all these conflicts were taking place. So the British wanted to expand westward, and the French wanted to contain the British and prevent them from expanding. So what the French wanted to do was to establish a hard boundary. And to do that, they wanted to build a series of forts all along this boundary. In fact, they wanted to build a whole chain of forts all the way down to the Mississippi Delta. But for now, we're up here. So they had already established some forts up north in Quebec and Montreal, and they were now trying to come down and establish more forts. And the key point of contention was in modern-day Pittsburgh, which is right here. So Pittsburgh is in western Pennsylvania, although then it was called the Ohio country, but today it's in modern-day Pennsylvania. So this is the location of Pittsburgh, and as you can see, it is right on the boundary of the French territory in blue and the British territory in red. So Pittsburgh was a strategic location, and both France and Britain wanted to control it and wanted to build a fort there. So this is a view of modern-day Pittsburgh. You can see these tall buildings here are downtown Pittsburgh. And the reason Pittsburgh was so important to both France and Britain is because of its strategic location along these rivers. So this is the Allegheny River here, and this is the Monongahela River here, and they both flow into the Ohio River. So this point right here, right in the middle, is a strategically valuable point, and they both wanted to build a fort right at the point. Now, if you look, you can see that right at the tip here, there are no tall buildings, and that is because this is now a historical site and a park in light of this particular situation between the French and the British. So here's a closer look at the point here. And this is the outline of Fort Duquesne, which ended up being built. This was one of the forts that ended up being built. So this is not the original foundation, but the historic preservationists recreated the foundation by outlining it in bricks. So you can see it from above. Now today it's a park, and you can go and see where this fort was. So this was the strategic location where both the French and the British wanted to build a fort. The French begin building a fort on this critical site here at Pittsburgh. But when the British find out about this, the British say, oh, that's not cool, and they send some men, they kick out the French, and the British start building their fort at this site. When the French find out about this, they send more men, this time armed military men. The French kick out the British. The French knock down what the British had started building, and the French resume building their fort on this site. Okay, so a tussle here is going on. When this gets back to the governor of Virginia on the British side, the governor of Virginia says, I can't just let the French, running loose here on this. I got to send, a contingent over. So he calls upon this young guy in colonial Virginia. Now, so this guy was born in Virginia under the British Crown. Now, remember, this is, the year we're in is now 1754. So this is a full 20 years before the American Revolutionary War. So nobody's thinking about an independent America at this point. Everybody's under the British Crown. They're all loyal subjects of the British Crown. They believe in the British Crown, all that. So this guy, he was born in colonial Virginia under the British Crown, and he was part of the colonial militia. Okay, so the militia is, the word militia sounds like military, sounds like an army, and it's kind of an army, but it's kind of a quasi-army. It's more like it's regular citizens who, every once in a while grab their guns and serve on a mission on a part-time basis. So they're not full-time soldiers, they're not a full-time army, they haven't had the training, all of that, sort of a part-time kind of army. So this guy is an officer in the Virginia militia. So who is this guy? This guy is none other than George Washington. Okay, and yes, that is the George Washington, the guy who would many years later become the commander-in-chief of the entire Continental Army in the American Revolutionary War, the guy who leads America to independence from Britain, the guy who is a founding father of the United States, the first president of the United States, and the guy who has his head on the quarter and the $1 bill. That's how you know when you've made it. It's that George Washington, okay? But at this point in time, he is not famous. He is just a young guy. He is 22 years old, and he is just an officer in the colonial militia in Virginia. So the governor of Virginia calls upon this guy, George Washington, and he says, all right, so I want you to, gather together some militiamen and head off to this Pittsburgh site here we want to kind of try to secure the site because we want to build our fort there. And the orders that he gave to George Washington were, we don't want you starting any battles, okay? So now, of course, if you are attacked or find yourself in some difficult situation, you are, of course, authorized to use force, and you're then permitted to do whatever you need to do, engage in battles, kill people, whatever you need to do. Okay, so essentially his orders were, don't start anything. So Washington gathers together some colonial militiamen, and off they go to Pittsburgh. So Washington hooks up with this Indian chief who was an ally of the British at the time, and through intelligence they discover that the French had basically sent a very similar contingent to the site, just like Washington's contingent. And it later turned out that the orders that were given to that French commander were basically the same orders that Washington received, which were, don't start any battles. But of course, if you are attacked or you find yourself in a difficult situation, then you're authorized to use force, engage in battles, and kill people. Okay. So, but it's interesting because neither side was instructed to attack. Okay. So the Indian chief then sends word to George Washington and says, hey, Washington, I just found the camp of this French contingent. So he says, I'm here with about a dozen warriors. So Washington, grab some of your men and come over here and meet me at this camp. And Washington does it. So Washington meets this Indian chief, and there they are spying on this French camp. And Washington decides, along with the Indian chief, to attack the French camp. Okay. Now, what happened after that is a matter of great controversy and dispute. So what we do know is that there was a battle. It lasted for about 15 minutes, and that Washington's side, along with his Indian allies, they prevailed. So the French lost. And basically all of the Frenchmen were either killed or taken hostage. And one of the Frenchmen who was killed was the commander of that French contingent. Okay. But how it actually went down and what actually happened is a matter of great controversy. So George Washington says that it was just a normal battle. Okay, the French started firing at us, we started firing at them, and everybody who died in battle, and that's what happens in battle, but there was nothing untoward about any of this. Okay? The French, however, have a completely different version. So what the French say is that these French were massacred by the British and their Indian allies. And there's a couple versions of this story. One is that the French commander was trying to negotiate. So he was reading these articles for negotiation, and while he was reading the articles for negotiation, he was shot by the British in cold blood. That's one version. Another version is that all these French were sleeping and they were attacked while they were sleeping by the British and their Indian allies. And another version is that while the French were trying to negotiate, this commander was negotiating terms, it was the Indians who started it, that the Indian chief pulled out his tomahawk and buried it in the skull of this French commander. So, what the truth was, we will never know. But word of this massacre gets back to the French side, and as it turns out, the commander who was killed, the French commander who was killed, his brother was also in the military and was also on site, and his brother is the one who finds out about this. So his brother raises 500 soldiers, and they come marching after Washington. Okay? So they catch up to Washington. There's a brief battle, but Washington is vastly outnumbered, so the French overtake Washington's men. Now, the French do not kill Washington or kill his men, but they do make Washington sign these articles of capitulation, where Washington, agrees that he was defeated in this battle, and then they let Washington, retreat. So one matter of controversy is that in these articles of capitulation, it says that the French commander who was killed was assassinated. Now, this is exactly opposite of what Washington is saying, because what Washington is saying is, it was a battle that was fair and square, but assassination that is not appropriate. So, it's a sort of a black mark against Washington's name. What happened, was Washington forced to sign it, or, there's some say that the document itself was written in the language of French. So Washington did not speak French. So maybe Washington, there was something was lost in translation, that Washington didn't realize that that's what the French meaning of that was, that it was assassination. But that is what it said, and that is what Washington signed. So word of these skirmishes then, these two battles end up going up the chain all the way on both sides. Back in England, they go up the chain, and back in France, they go up the chain. And what do these two countries decide to do? They send more forces. Both of them send more forces into the United States. This ends up escalating things. So with both sides sending in more forces, this leads to more skirmishes, more conflicts, and pretty soon this escalates the entire situation to full-blown war. And both countries end up declaring war on each other. Britain declares war on France, France declares war on Britain. So this was all caused by George Washington. Back at this site, neither side, neither Britain and France, authorized an attack here on this situation. It was George Washington out in the field making a decision in the spur of the moment to attack the French, right? That is what caused this war. So this was, potentially a huge mistake and a huge blunder. Now we all make mistakes, and certainly military commanders make mistakes, but this was not a small mistake. This wasn't just we made a tactical error, or we lost a battle or something. This resulted in a full-blown global war. Okay, so in some respects it is somewhat of an inspirational moment in that George Washington went on to be this great war hero and great statesman and hero, and had this spectacular career. And it turns out that, when he was a young man at 22, he potentially made this huge blundering mistake. And it just shows that, everybody makes mistakes. Even people who are famous and successful, they make mistakes too. So just like we all make mistakes, the lesson is that, we all need to, accept our mistakes, get over our mistakes, learn from our mistakes, and go on, because you still can go on to achieve great things. So that's a little inspirational moment there from the history of George Washington. So the war then kicks off, right? So this kicks off this war, this global war that's called the 7 Years' War. So it's called the 7 Years' War all around the world. The portion of the war that takes place in the United States is called the French and Indian War. Now that's a confusing name, because it suggests the French were fighting against the Indians, but that actually wasn't the case. It was the French and the Indians were together, and it was the British who were fighting against the French and the Indians. So it's kind of confusing. It's also confusing because the British also had Indians on their side. So the British had some Indians on their side, and the French had some Indians on their side. But the reason that it's called the French and Indian Wars is because France was very much outnumbered in terms of their colonialists. So, France was never really super successful in colonializing their territory. So they had 60,000 French colonialists in their territory, whereas Britain had 2 million colonialists in their territories. There's, the English colonialists were far more than the French. So in order for the French to be successful in battle, they had to get a lot of Indians to fight on the side of the French against the British. So that's why it's sort of referred to as the French and Indian Wars. So, although this does highlight one aspect, which is that, the Indians, the poor Indians, they had this horrible situation thrust upon them at no fault of their own. Not only were, so the Indians are, in their own land living, thousands of years, and then all of a sudden these Europeans invade from all over, make war on the Indians, take their lands, basically destroy their entire lifestyle. Not only that, but then these invading Europeans, engage in war against each other, right? The Europeans are fighting each other. The French and the English are fighting each other on Indian territory, right? Now, you could say, well, the Indians could just sit back and let these Europeans fight each other, but that is not how it happened. Both sides, both the French and the English, were turning to the Indians and forcing the Indians to pick a side. It was either you're with us or you're against us. So they were forcing the Indians to pick a side, and they were forcing the Indians to fight on behalf of one side or the other. So, this is just a horrible situation to be in for the Indians. It's bad enough that you have these Europeans coming in, but then they're forcing you to fight in a war that you don't even want to be in, that you don't even care about. It's just a horrible thing. Actually, this was the war that was depicted in the movie The Last of the Mohicans, starring Daniel Day-Lewis, which was adapted from the book by James Fenimore Cooper. It was a great movie. It's worthwhile seeing. It was very, very well done. So this kicks off this war. So in the American theater here, you've got the French basically fighting against the English, all about their boundaries. This is the North American theater of the global 7 Years' War. This theater is also known as the French and Indian War. So you can see this is the northeast of the United States, what became the United States, and here is Canada. The light colored territory, it represents France's territory, and the darker color represents Britain's territory. So here is Pennsylvania. And here on the western side of Pennsylvania is Pittsburgh. This is the site of the critical site of Pittsburgh, where they both wanted to build their fort, and they sort of tussled over that. And also, this is what kicked off the whole war right here, when George Washington bungled it and attacked the French contingent. So here is Fort William Henry. This was the fort that was depicted in the movie The Last of the Mohicans, and it is located in upstate New York. So here is New York City. Down here is Long Island. Here's New York City. And this is the Hudson River. And about right here is Albany. So in the movie, Colonel Monroe was at Fort William Henry for Britain. And in the movie, his daughters came to Albany, and then from Albany, they trekked on foot up to Fort William Henry to see their father, Colonel Monroe. Although on the way, they were ambushed by the duplicitous Indian Magua, although that ambush was unsuccessful because they were saved by Hawkeye. And Hawkeye agreed to take them the rest of the way up to Fort William Henry. When they got to the fort, they found that the fort was under siege by the French, and that fort ended up falling to the French, and that was all depicted in the movie. So in terms of the war between France and Britain here, recall that this territory was basically France's home base territory for their settlements in the New World, and they came in here through the Gulf of St. Lawrence and down the St. Lawrence River. This is how they came into the New World. And the river system was of critical importance because this is how supplies were delivered to the land here, because the territory was very rough. So this whole territory depended upon travel upon the waterway system here. So Britain's strategy in the war, since they had a superior navy, was to blockade the Gulf of St. Lawrence and blockade the St. Lawrence River. That cut the supply line from France, and it resulted in the downfall of France, and it resulted in Britain winning this war. Britain wins the war with France in the United States, and this is huge. The consequences are enormous. So as a result of this war, Britain kicks out France, kicks them out of the United States. Bye-bye. So this brings to an end France's presence in the United States. Now, France does make an encore reappearance, as we will see shortly, but that is only brief. So the consequences of this war is it ends France's presence in the United States. So what happens to France's territory? Before the war, France had owned all of this territory in blue. So now that France is getting kicked out of the United States, the question is, what happens to all of this territory that was formerly owned by France? Well, The two remaining European empires, Britain and Spain, divided it up between themselves. This was resolved in the treaty that ended the war. And this was the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which was basically between France, England, and Spain. So the answer was in that treaty that it basically revolved around the Mississippi River. So all of the territory to the east of the Mississippi River went to Britain, and all of the territory to the west of the Mississippi River went to Spain. So here's a closer look at that. So this is the Mississippi River here, and the territory on both sides used to be owned by France. So this territory and this territory was previously owned by France. The territory in yellow is the territory that went to Spain, and the territory in pink is the territory that went to Britain. Now, as part of this treaty, Florida was also given to Britain. Now, Florida had been previously owned by Spain, but as part of the treaty, Spain agreed to give Florida to Britain. Now, you may be wondering, why would Spain give Florida to Britain? And the answer was that it had to do with territory outside of the United States. And remember, this war, this 7 Years' War, was a global war involving properties all around the world. So during that war, Britain had seized some territory that was valuable to Spain, and Spain wanted it back. So there were two cities. There was Havana, Cuba, and Manila in the Philippines that Britain had seized from Spain. So those two cities were far more important to Spain than was Florida. So they traded. So the deal was that Britain would return Havana, Cuba, and Manila in the Philippines to Spain, and in exchange, Spain would give Florida to Britain. So as a result, the United States now consisted of, we're down to two countries. So this is the Mississippi River here. To the east of the Mississippi River, it was all owned by Britain, and everything to the west of the Mississippi River was owned by Spain. So this means that France is out of the United States. So even though France is out, they certainly left a significant impression on the United States, and there are a number of places and their culture that survives today. So for many years, France owned all of this territory in blue, and they founded a number of cities in this territory that survive to this day, like New Orleans, certainly, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Biloxi, Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama, and cities further north as well. In the heart of the country, you had St. Louis, and even further north, cities like Detroit and Green Bay in Wisconsin. So France has certainly had a lasting impact on the United States. But nonetheless, France was out of the United States, and the United States now is owned by two countries, Britain and Spain. This arrangement seems like it might be a pretty good arrangement here for peace and stability. I mean, we're down to just two countries now, so it's just Britain and Spain. They've got a clear boundary between them at the Mississippi River, and in fact, both of these countries had just signed a treaty agreeing to this boundary. So it seems pretty good that all these wars that have been going on in this territory for over 100 years might now be brought to an end. In fact, at the time, it might even seem like this is the way it's going to be forever. And Britain had to be feeling pretty good about this because Britain just won this war. So Britain just kicked out France, right? France was causing all these problems with Britain, all these conflicts and wars and who's going to build a fort where and all that. So France is now gone, ending all of that conflict, and Britain just acquired more territory. So things are looking good for Britain, and Britain has to be thinking to themselves that the colonists have to be loving this as well, because the colonists benefit from this. The colonists were the ones who are living there. They're the ones who had a bunch of problems with France too. So now the colonists are free from all these skirmishes and wars with France. The colonists have more territory to expand and expand their business, control more of the fur trade, control the rivers. Like, this has to be great for the colonists as well. Everybody's going to be happy here. So things are looking pretty good and pretty rosy. So what Britain says is, all right, this is great, but we did spend a lot of money on this war. Cost us a lot of money to kick France out and acquire this additional territory. And so it seems only fair that the colonists should help us, recover some of our expenditures here, particularly because the colonists are benefiting from this as well. So Britain raises taxes on the colonists. Now, this does not go over very well with the colonists. It's always about money. It's always about money. So the colonists say, we don't like having our taxes increased. This is taxation without representation. And the colonists rebel. So Britain has to be saying to themselves, you've got to be kidding me. After all I've done for you, after all, it was me, it was Britain who established these colonies in the first place. We're the ones who, spent all this money sending all these ships and settlers over, and we're the ones who built all these colonies in the first place. And now we just spent all this money on this war, getting France out, getting more territory. And now that things finally look settled, this is your way of thanking us, turning on us and rebelling? This is not cool. So Britain sends some forces over to the New World to suppress this rebellion. But of course, it does not work. The colonists continue to rebel, and they begin the American Revolutionary War, the War for Independence, where the colonists are fighting for their freedom and independence from Britain. Now, it might seem like the main combatants here in the war are Britain versus the colonists, and indeed those were the principal combatants. But as is the case with a number of these regional significant conflicts, world powers are also involved. So, this is just like in modern day United States today. So you see the United States, grappling with whether to arm the rebels in, various countries, like whether the United States should arm the rebels in Iraq or arm the rebels in Afghanistan or arm the rebels in Syria. And, this has been going on for a long time. A few decades ago, Ronald Reagan was arming the rebels in Nicaragua. And, this has a long history. Well, this turns out to be a play from the age-old playbook. This has been going on forever. So it was even the case back in the 1700s. But back then, France was a global power. So just like today, where you see the United States grappling with whether to arm the rebels in, say, Syria, back then, France was grappling with whether to arm the rebels in America. The rebels were the colonists in America. And the French decide to do it. They decide to arm the rebels. So from very early on, the French were providing all sorts of assistance to these colonial rebels. So they were providing, financing and arms and, all sorts of stuff. And then they ended up joining the war officially. So, America declared its independence in 1776. And France officially joined the war in 1778 on the side of the colonial rebels. So, and at the time, France had an alliance with Spain, so Spain kind of came in with France the following year and also joined the war in 1779. So you have Britain fighting the colonists, but the colonists were joined by France and Spain. So, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why would France join this war? Why would France join the American Revolutionary War, particularly since they're not even in this country anymore? And, some might say that, well, the reason was because France believed in liberty and they believed in freedom. And so they were doing this out of an altruistic motivation to help all of humankind. And maybe that was true, or maybe that was part of it. But you have to kind of wonder, well, wait a minute, France was a global empire at this time. They had their own colonial territories around the world, and they weren't setting those colonial territories free with the spirit of liberty and independence. So it kind of casts some doubt on that motivation. But France had other motivations as well. So remember, France had just been kicked out of this country by Britain a dozen years ago in the 7 Years' War. So they are bitter against Britain. So this was an opportunity to get back at Britain. But also, France and Britain were competing world empires at this time. They both had various colonial territories all around the world, and they're competing with each other. They're rivals. So if one of these empires, if the British Empire is weakened, then that would potentially strengthen the French Empire, because the French would, their rival would be weakened. So France actually had a motivation to see Britain weaken and to see Britain lose this territory in the New World. So it seems that those factors may have had a slight edge over this altruistic feeling here. So but France was a huge factor in this war. They were a huge factor. They provided all sorts of stuff, arms and boots on the ground. They provided real troops. So the French troops were fighting arm in arm next to the American troops. In fact, it's sort of funny because you look back in the prior war, the 7 Years' War with George Washington. Remember George Washington, the young colonist in Virginia. So at that time, George Washington was fighting under the British crown. So he was fighting for Britain against France. And now in this Revolutionary War, George Washington, he's the head of the United States Continental Army. George Washington is fighting against Britain, and now he's aligned with France. So it's amazing how the tables turned here in a very short period of time. So, but the France's assistance and Spain's assistance was huge in this war. Warships, all sorts of stuff. And in fact, even in the decisive battle of the war, which was the siege at Yorktown, that was the battle that really broke Britain's will to continue the war. France was a huge factor in that battle as well. And a number of historians say there is no way that the colonists would have won this war without the participation of France and Spain. So this was a huge factor in the war. So as a result of this all, the colonists prevail. The colonists win the war. They win the American Revolutionary War. So Britain is kicked out of America. So this is the end of British participation in America, the end of the presence of the British Empire in America, and this is the establishment of the United States of America. This is the territory owned by the brand spanking new nation of the United States of America. And this territory is reflected here in blue, both the light and the dark blue. So when the United States won the American Revolutionary War, they kicked out Britain. Now, Britain retained its interests up in Canada, but Britain was kicked out of the United States. And this brought to an end forever the presence of the British Empire in the United States. The British Empire would be no more here in the United States. So at the end of the Revolutionary War, America basically just took over the territory that Britain owned. Now, there's one exception to that, and that is Florida. So Britain owned Florida previously, and that had happened 20 years ago at the end of the prior war, in the 7 Years' War in 1763. Britain was able to take Florida from Spain because Spain had actually founded Florida, owned Florida for hundreds of years, but 20 years ago, Britain was able to take Florida away from Spain. So at the end of this war, the American Revolutionary War, America returned Florida to Spain. So why would America return Florida to Spain? And the reason is because Spain assisted America in the Revolutionary War. So during the Revolutionary War, when the colonists were fighting Britain, Britain owned Florida, and they were using Florida to launch attacks against the colonists. So Britain was using Florida to launch attacks up this way against the colonists, and they also used Florida as a base for their ships, for their fleets. So the British ships would sail from Florida up the coast and attack the colonists here, and then return to Florida. So Florida was a pretty good home base for Britain. So to help out the colonists during the war, Spain attacked Florida. They attacked British Florida, and Spain started taking back territory along this way, and that was a pretty big problem for Britain, and it helped the colonists. So as a result, at the end of the Revolutionary War, the Americans returned Florida back to Spain. So this is what the situation looked like at the end of the Revolutionary War, which was the beginning of America. This is the founding of America right here. This is what America owned at the beginning. So in terms of this whole territory here that is now the United States, we have just two nations. We have the United States owning this part, and we have Spain owning this part. And the boundary was the same with the Mississippi River plus Florida.